Hello, everybody. Thanks again for showing up. Again, this is just going to be us talking with me and Matthew. Actually, this time, Matthew showed up, which I'm sure he's got something to say about that. But we're just hanging out, kind of discussing some differences of opinions and, I guess, belief systems. And hopefully it'll be fun, and we'll have some interesting things to hammer out tonight. Matthew, what would you like to say?
Well, your PayPal finally came through. That's pretty much all there is to it. I mean, I'm here because you paid me. Why else?
Well, but that goes without saying. I can't believe you dropped out last week just because my check didn't clear. When have I ever not paid you, man?
No, I had some very unpleasant and frustrating technical difficulties. Anybody who's ever tried to run one of these Hangouts before knows that those can sometimes just stonewall you and keep you from doing anything you want to do. So I apologize for not being able to be here. It sounded like it was a very good, productive discussion. So I'm looking forward to this one. And Trey, I understand that you wanted to focus on the transmission, uh, the the beliefs in the Christian, I guess the historical, the framework of how transmission works according to the Christian belief system, I guess would be the best way to put it. So it's nice to meet you, Trey.
It's nice to get to meet you too, Matt. Yeah, no, man, we're happy to be here. And we're happy to, obviously, this one's a pretty fun topic for us. The way that we get our Bible is, it's pretty integral to, obviously, the Christian belief system and what the Bible truly is to us. So, yeah, no, obviously, with what we're talking about, the New Testament in particular, the 27 books of the New Testament are broken into some specific, four specific groupings. There's going to be the Gospels, the Epistles, one book of prophecy, and one book of historical accounts. And so we have an understanding that each one inside of those criterias was written down for different purposes. But the biggest conceptions, obviously, with the transmission of the text is one, understanding the nature and belief of the people who were both writing the texts and all the people who were transmitting it through time. So some commonly held beliefs in that, obviously, would be that since all of the original authors of these texts were apostles or scribes of apostles, that they all advocated that these were derived from God, that their words were inspired, so that they were the original texts in particular were divinely inspired. Now, the divine inspiration, the number one misconception typically is that we have say verbatim divine inspiration that encompasses all of the text that we have to date. We don't actually hold that belief. We actually just hold that they are inerrant copies of those divinely inspired texts, and therefore they have what you would call a derived inspiration. We are able to derive the inspiration of the texts because of the inerrancy in the text itself. And obviously, I'm going to say some words that some people are going to be a little more unfamiliar with, so I'll go through some definitions as we go along. Inerrancy, referring to the truth of the text. It's to say, there are multiple ways to say a specific thing, in instance, in any language, but even with multiple ways to say it, you can say it multiple ways and still be saying the same conception truthfully. So, famous texts that we quote will be 2 Timothy 3:16 and 1 Corinthians 2:13 for verification of the apostolic perspective of inerrancy. and of their own individual inspiration. Among other, from a historical perspective, however, the timeliness and creation of these texts adds a lot of credence to the authorship understanding as well. Namely, that when you have authors like Paul obviously having access to the letters written by Peter and the gospel written by Peter and quotations and references to other ones of these books, it gives a conception and an understanding that these were all written at the exact same time period by these people, and that they had access to each other's works, not potentially all of each other's works, but at least specific people having specific access to other people's works at any point in time. They were well circulated. Obviously, you're talking about a Hebrew culture where, the transmissions of these texts, we find copies in not just, obviously, the letters written to Corinth wasn't just in the church at Corinth. It was transmitted and sent to other churches as well. So when you find different variant texts being transmitted between these churches, even though they weren't written to them originally, you have an understanding that that there was an intentional protection and canonization of these specific works that that was being, even in the earliest church with the apostles there, was being attempted to evangelize and preserve these texts. There's also the cultural ramifications of the Hebrews. Obviously, they shared scriptures in church on Sunday. These texts, these texts would have been something that was written not just to be transcribed to that church, but would have been shared in the middle of what they would do for their Sunday or Saturday synagogue services. So the specificity of the authorship was one of those things where the entire church had a common understanding of it. Early church fathers from as early as, you've got Tertullian, Justin Martyr, all corroborated each individual one of the texts as well. So you have every major church father, actually every existing church father, corroborated every single one between all of them of the texts that are present in the New Testament. So they were commonly used all the way through the 1st through the 5th century in the canonization of the texts, which we go through the understanding that the apostles began this. The people who they were written to continued and transcribed it. The apostolic fathers then started verifying and removing any works that were, let's just say that they needed to make some distinctions, because there's a large quantity of written works that obviously did not make it into the Bible. So they broke it into basically 4 different categorizations. There's the homologumena, which it's just a term that is utilized for the universally held books by every single one of the apostolic fathers from each of the different church traditions. So you have multiple canons going on from the 2nd century all the way till the Council of Nicaea, and even late 1st century. And the purpose in them was we had a ecclesiastical mandate. These were being read in church, and they claimed to be divinely inspired. So distinguishing which ones had divine authority versus ones that were just what would be considered Gnostic or pseudepigraphal works, ones that were not to say that they weren't useful in some regard, but they were not inspired. They were not from an apostolic person. So the distinctions were being made pretty early on this in order to distinguish what needed to be translated to evangelize to other churches and other continents, and secondly, what was to be prepared and read in their own services. There was a theological mandate that was created. Earliest heretical movements include major church fathers like Tertullian contesting against Marcion, who had his own conception of which books were being used for any part in time. So, but even inside of all of this, there was what is known as the homologumena. There were texts that everybody knew the authorship of them. Nobody contested it for any reason whatsoever, and it's because we're talking about people who had grandparents who, or who had parents who literally worked and experienced life with the apostles themselves. So when you have that as part of your culture, there's the ability to contest something that is physically been witnessed is entirely different than something than just a secondhand book that you might have gotten from someone else. And then naturally, by the later 3rd century, you started noticing there was a massive political shift, which created the finalization of the canon, and that was the Diocletian persecutions. We had, at one point in time, the Roman Empire was murdering all Christians on sight, and there were specific instructions to burn and destroy all of Scripture. So with Diocletian, you had an understanding that the preservation of the Scriptures became important at a much more high integral level, with not just the blood of the martyrs being the cost of having the Scriptures, but obviously preservation of the texts. If they're being burnt, the protection of these for future generations and for evangelism took a very personal role, with people's lives being on the line. This obviously didn't last long, as it is that 25 years later, the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, and then you have the Nicene Council and the formulation of the canon of Scriptures. But even before that, with the ecclesiastical and theological understandings, there were several different canons that existed at all points in time that we have historical records of. A couple of good references are Old Syriac translation. It dates as late as 400 AD. It was made for the East, and that particular canon didn't include 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, Jude, or Revelation. And that was predominantly because of the location it was made for. The books were each individual book or letter. For instance, the letter to Corinth was sent to Corinth. Well, likewise, if this the Syriac translation being sent east, if any of particular letters were sent to, say, the West, they may not have been authenticated or verified or present in any codex of any kind in those early translations. In fact, the other codexes are great examples of that. For instance, the Latin translation, which was the huge advocation of early church fathers like Justin Martyr and Tertullian, it actually excluded Hebrews, James, and 1st and 2nd Peter for the exact same reason that the Syriac translation removed some, was that they were unable to verify the text, or they didn't have it present at the time of the form of their canon. The Old Latin translation was as late as 200 AD. There's also the Muratorian canon, or what's typically known as the incomplete version of it. That was available, just like the Latin canon, at 170 AD. And then one of the most famous canons is the Codex Borratio. In 206 AD, it was one of the few canons that canonized both the Old Testament and the New Testament, with the exclusion of two major texts, Esther and the Revelation of John. So you have this understanding that canonization has been occurring for in excess of 100 years for specific purposes. And inside of this, because of the literature we have of everything from church fathers to apocryphal works, we understand specifically there are certain texts that everybody was universally held, and then there are certain texts that everybody universally just didn't respect at all. These were for Gnostic churches or heretics. And then there is the anti-logumena, which is typically what's called like the omitted texts. It's not to say that they were disputed at any point in time early on. It was merely typically the questions that came forward were around whether these particular texts met the criteria for a complete canon. Eusebius obviously wrote an entire church history of this, but the anti-logumena include the book of Hebrews, James, 2 Peter, 2 John, 3 John, Jude, and the book of Revelation. The typical conceptions of why they were contested is that there were two major translations. There was an Eastern translation and a Western translation. And because of the inability to verify locally each individual one, it was only when they were brought together that they were able to authenticate all the texts together. Many of the books of the New Testament maintain an anonymity around the authorship, even though the assertions of the authorship are made in specific canons and are assumed through textual criticism. So that had questions that everybody wanted to answer on that one. Books like the Book of Jude reference non-canonical works like the Book of Enoch. So there was a question of that, and then the largest question that raised when these were being unified as a canon was when heretics would misuse passages from these books in order to pursue their personal agendas. Basically, it made these books be looked at more carefully before they were allowed into the finalization of the canon. Now, there's the final classification of books would be what you consider apocryphal books. The apocryphal books are neither considered scripture, nor are they part of the canon itself, but they speak specifically to teachings of that time period, and they authenticate the both specific canons and time periods for these canons. So they have a relevance to a historical context, even though we don't consider them part of the scriptures themselves. The Didache, however, being a great reference, is as early, typically considered as 100 AD. Teaches about the 12. It has unified doctrines of religious practice like Lord's Supper or baptism. It even talks about the return of Christ, and it talks about the faith, the entirety of our faith, in a very small, proportionate document. So it authenticates the understandings and teachings of that time period, and it quotes specific Bible passages, just like many of the other apocryphal works. So even though we wouldn't consider them to say, be canonized, they give us a perspective on Scripture. Because of these things, obviously, by the 3rd century and 4th century, the New Testament is completely, largely at this point in time, uncontested by any Orthodox religion whatsoever. So at this point in time, the entirety of our scriptures are present. Now, now we have to get the additional, 1,700 years to now, which is where textual criticism comes in. We have literally thousands of manuscripts in Greek dating back to the 2nd century. Some incomplete, some complete, but we have such a large variation. There's at least 5,000 or more dating dating just Greek transcripts, and the problem is with this large amount of texts, we have obviously, we have scribes transcribing these for this entire period with multiple transition, or with 4 different specific lines of transmission. You have an Alexandrian line, you have the Caesarean line, you have the Western line, and you have the Byzantine line. And each one of them has its own scribes, its own variations on how to say things. So we have these 4 basic transmissions, 5,000 at least texts that we have currently to date. That's just the ones that you'd reference in books like Bruce Metzger's Text of the New Testament. But because of this, there's an understanding that we have to answer certain speculations and questions. Why do people use so many different ways of saying the exact same thing in so many varieties of texts? Well, you have 4 entirely separate lines of transmission for the Greek. So just assuming that, you're going to have a lot of variation. You have individual scribes, which will make textual errors, which we would have to fix later, which occurs in numerous different ways. But in general, in the entirety of the 27 books, their variations typically only occur in less than 10,000 places. So compositionally, all of the variations are, from a textual criticism standpoint, are fairly insignificant. In fact, 99% by the time we get through textual criticism to creating what we have in the English Bibles now, 99% of it is completely unified, with a couple of odd contestations. Namely, we have a couple of what were called the pericope. So there are things that were in later Greek translations that weren't in earlier ones, that are marked and distinguished inside of the Bibles as separate because they're not present in the earlier texts. So what we see is a transmission of texts to Greek, and then the English translations that came out, everything from King James to modern ESV I have right next to me. Each one of those utilizes these thousands of Greek translations to compose these new translations. And the benefits of textual criticism has allowed us to get get more precise in being more authentic to the original text. But even with the variations,
hey Trey, could I just
yeah,
could I just interrupt there for a second? I have been listening very carefully to what you've been saying, and it's obvious that you have spent a lot of time and put a lot of thought into researching how the Bible became what it is now. And I have two questions. First, can you explain briefly, because I think it's just something that needs to be clarified to the lay listener, what do you mean when you say transmission? As far as you said, there are 4 different major transmissions going on right now. Please explain what you mean by what is one of those transmissions.
Yeah, gladly. What do you mean by transmission is we have scribes historically who have taken a text and they have copied it down in order to transmit it to another language or to create just another copy of this text. So in doing so, they are basically, they take a copy of the work that they have and then they rewrite it, hand it to whomever, and that is what is the process of that over the course of history is what's called is what we're referring to as transmission. And the 4 specific ones are...
Okay, so what you mean...
Yeah. Go ahead.
So what you mean is the transmission of the content of the Bible, of the original writings, which we no longer have. You're saying that the copying by scribes and the interpretation and just sort of trying to glean the actual meaning by scribes, human scribes, over generation after generation over the last 1700 years. You're not talking about, say, the transmission of the spirit, the supernatural dimension of the Bible. You're talking about the actual words, the written content of the Bible that is being transmitted from scribe to scribe over the centuries and scholar to scholar. Yes?
That's correct. Yeah, when we're talking about, especially when you're talking about the Greek texts, we don't have any of the original texts. They don't exist presently. The furthest texts we have back would date back to the 1st century at best. So we have a conception that we have copies. We don't hold that we have the inspired originals. We merely have the inerrant copies of the inspired originals.
Okay, so that brings me to my second question in how you establish the inerrancy of the copies themselves. When okay, so let's put it this way: you've already acknowledged that there's approximately 1%. Some say 1.5%. Some say as much as 3%. But let's say 1%, just to be generous. You already established that there is this 1% of unknown. In other words, something that we can't seem to get around in terms of what the original meaning was. So can you just bridge, again, just for a lay listener, bridge the gap between going from not having the original copies to establishing the inerrancy of the copies with that 1% variation?
That's an excellent question. So when we're talking about variation, when you have, say, let's just assume that we're going with the basis of what they did for textual criticism. You have 5,000 different Greek copies that they used to create our English copies now. So you have 5,000, and there is a unified meaning to, let's say, what they were saying is 99%, and I'll deal with the 1% next, but we'll go with the 99%. There is a lot of variations in saying the exact same thing linguistically between the different lines, but inerrancy is able to be easily understood because just from a textual criticism's perspective, when you have that many copies and everybody saying the exact same thing from that many different regions, from that many different traditions, from that many different peoples, and they all are saying the exact same thing, you have a conception that they copied it from somebody else. And if they all copied it that authentically, it is truly actually miraculous. Even if you don't believe the Bible's inspired, truly it is the most historically significant book that has ever been written.
All right, so I'm willing to concede, just at least for the sake of argument, that it has been very accurately transmitted, to use the explanation that you're providing, over the last 1,700 years. It's very well maintained in that sense, relatively speaking. I have no issue with that. The issue comes from not the it's not from what is agreed upon to be the canon. To me, the issue comes from the unknown, the contents of that 1% to 3%, whatever it is, how that unknown might affect the other 99% in such a way that it changes what we think we know about it.
Well, I shouldn't say it, the problem is I should have gone through the explanation of what the 1% exactly is. The 1%, it isn't exactly what you'd call a compositional unknown. It's what you would say is we don't understand why they translated it, or why they the scribe made the translation that way. For instance, there are reasons that they would make translational errors. One of the most popular ones is to repeat a word accidentally. Like one of the famous translations from the Alexandrian line, when Pilate comes out and asks, "Who do you want, Jesus or Barabbas?" Well, he in the compositional line, he says, "Who do you want, Jesus, Barabbas, or Jesus?" And the problem was it's a repetition. It's not to we know what happened. We don't think that Pilate said, "Oh, do you want Jesus twice?" No, we just think that the scribe wrote it down because he was transcribing and he wrote the same letter or same words twice. Parchment was expensive. It's a cultural thing. Some mistakes are related to the fact that they didn't use grammatical structuring the way we did. So basically they didn't make separations, so we have to basically separate their grammar into a context that we understand. And so let's say that they run two sentences together. This is another variation in the text because people accidentally will run these two texts together. The 1% variation is in regards to, it's not to say that we have an illusory unknown that could affect our text. The 1% isn't an unknown. It's something where we don't know why the scribe made the mistake that they did, or we don't know why it was added in later. Like, for instance, I'll go through the popular ones: the pericope adulterae, the comma Johannem, and the famous last 12 verses of Mark are all. I mean, you look inside my Bible; it specifically says that the earliest forms of the Greek text don't actually have these in them. So even my Bible says, we don't hold these to be authentic with the original text, but we put them in they're put in there anyways. But we have this conception that there are those that were put in that are not represented in, say, the 2nd century text, but by the 5th and 6th century, all of a sudden, they're very prevalent. So we know that there's something that was added in for maybe a theological content later, and we dictate those as separate. That would be compositionally part of the 1%. We don't say that would be compositionally part of the 1%. Would be like the pericopes and things of that nature.
Trey, can I hate to jump in and cut you off, man. Did you want to keep going there, or can I ask something? I want to take a step back, kind of.
No, that's perfect. Yeah, feel free to ask whatever you like.
Okay. One of the things that I guess, I don't know, you were talking about Pilate and Barabbas and all of that. That's actually one of my big I guess problems with the New Testament, is that we have never found anything in any of the Roman customs where anybody ever did what Pilate was reported to do there. There was never a custom of releasing a prisoner like they did with Barabbas. To me, that would be more of a reason to question that story than to believe it. And I guess that's one of the things that, I mean, I don't want to nitpick things apart, but when things come up, I definitely want to address them. And knowing, I guess, well, maybe you don't know. As much research as you've done, I'm assuming that you've gone back and looked at Roman tradition, and Pilate in specific was a horrific individual, and the way that the Bible colors Pilate is nowhere close to reflective of what Pilate, as far as how the Romans themselves recorded his actions, let alone that instance with Barabbas. We don't have any evidence outside the Bible that ever happened.
Extra biblical texts are actually a lot of fun. I love a lot of what we can learn from extra biblical texts. Like I said, the number one thing I think the apocrypha happens to be useful for is to give context to what we understood about the canonization of Scripture and the biblical texts. To be specific to your question, though, there was a very unique government environment that existed in Judea and Jerusalem at that point in time. You're familiar with King Herod and his presence in that region, and you're familiar with the fact that Pilate's governorship put him over that, but Herod would have had kingship. And the problem is a lot of people are unfamiliar with what's called the Maccabees Revolt, and several revolts that occurred in the Judaic region. The reason that most people would have no problem with the conception of concession of releasing a prisoner is, you're right, it's not a Roman tradition. It's actually a Judaic one, to give mercy to maybe a refugee or anything like that. It was a concession to give to the people, because it was also Roman tradition to put the standards across the entire country, but that wasn't prevalent in Jerusalem because it caused these revolts again and again, because all these people worship the one God, and the moment they put the god Caesar above them, they wanted to start a fight over it. So it was it's basically an understanding of the historical context of that time. You're entirely right that was not wouldn't have been prevalent and has not been documentedly prevalent in any other part of the Roman culture. But likewise, concessions had to be made in that region because we have such a long historical documented line of revolts led by the Judaic culture against the Roman Empire. Now, naturally, all of them were unsuccessful, but in order to basically keep the peace, it was basically a concession that is considered what Pilate would make to appease the leading classes of the Judaic culture at that time.
See, I would definitely have to disagree there. There's nothing that I've ever seen where Pilate has made any concession to the Jews. In fact, he was horrific toward the Jews. If anything, he would have taken that opportunity, if there was that tradition in place. Everything according to what history says about Pilate, he would have taken every opportunity to run contrary to whatever the tradition was. He was there because of how iron-fisted he was toward the Jews, and how unrelenting he was in allowing them to have any kind of concession. So, I mean, I guess the question is, do you have any historical documentation where Pilate ever made a concession to the Jews, outside the Bible, of course?
Well, I'll be honest. The documentation that we typically look at when talking about the biblical text is usually validation around key theologies or relevant representations. So, when we're looking at extra biblical texts, like let's say we were to look up Josephus, a famous Jew,
right.
He documented that that Christ died under the hands of Pilate, even though obviously he was not a Christian. So we look at a lot of them, but we're not going to assume that they're going to distinguish specific accounts of the Bible that they were not prevalent are present or prevalent for.
Sorry if I misspoke there, or I wasn't clear. Now, I don't mean specifically related to the Bible. I'm not saying that you would need Josephus to validate that Barabbas was freed. No, I'm saying anywhere in Pilate's recorded history, which is fairly extensive, where did he make concessions to the Jews? Because, I mean, to be honest, I have yet to find anywhere where Pilate would be make concessions to anyone, let alone the Jews. He reveled in making their life, for lack of a better term, a living hell.
Ned, hang on, Trey. Ned, what's the historical reference you're referring to that talks about Pilate?
Well, I'm saying anything outside the Bible, any of the historical documentation we have from that time is reflective of a, let's say, a Pilate that is less than as accommodating as the Bible would color him as. There's nothing there that I've been able to find in any of, I mean, again, across the board, any historical documentation that describes Pilate other than the Bible. Nothing colors him as being any way, shape, or form concessionary in anything. He ruled with an iron fist, and absolutely was just, for lack of a better term, horrific. I mean, you just, I guess, pick one. We don't. There's nothing. So that's what I'm saying is that's one of the. It's kind of interesting that we hit on that, because that is one of my biggest, I guess, problems with the New Testament, is that it colors Pilate in such a light that is so non-reflective of everything else we have.
Oh, I guess that's what I was wanting to ask.
If I could just...
go ahead.
Sorry, Landon, I think to bridge what you're saying and what Ned is saying, you're asking for a specific example, a specific source of context for the character, the actions, the behavior, the historical narrative of Pilate himself outside of the Bible that would lead someone to believe that he wasn't charitable toward the Jews. And I think what Ned is saying is that the notion that he was, in this case, with Jesus and Barabbas, that he was charitable. Ned is saying that to say that occurred is something that is justified. We would be justifiably skeptical about, based on other sources about what would be expected politically, according to his reign, for lack of a better term. So, are you, Landon, asking for historical documents to establish his character or his style of rule? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. What I would be curious of is which particular historical document is referring to Pilate that would make it exclusively contrary to him having the ability to do what he did according to the Gospels, as Trey was saying, in that particular region, to withhold some type of revolt. Now remember, he has to save face with the Roman authority, to where he may have, quote, wanted to rule with an iron fist and may have been ruthless, but in this particular event where the entire Sanhedrin was unified in this one event, for him to allow for a Jewish custom, and there were so many of these events which are described in the Gospels that are contrary even to the Jewish custom, in order to make sure this execution took place, which the Gospels bend over backwards to explain, to say this was so unordinary, this was so unorthodox, the extent they went through to make sure that Christ was crucified because they despised him so much. You would have to show me historical documentation that would allow that it would be impossible for Pilate to act in such a way. Now, is it something that is out of the ordinary or something that seems a little out of character in one sense? However, is there anything that would indicate that in that environment, at that time, at that place, in that region, with all of that going on, that would be something that's so far beyond character that therefore we would have to throw the account out as false based on this contrary? Is there enough valid historical evidence that's dated as early as the Gospel accounts to throw such a wrench in a story that we would call the whole thing into question? Okay,
I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't know you wanted specific references. The ones that I would reference would be probably Warren Carter's, and the book is called Pontius Pilate: Portraits of a Roman Governor, and that was I think 2000 something. It's been fairly recent. But there was also the other one by Helen K. Bond, Pontius Pilate in History and the Interpretation. I guess the other one that would kind of shed some more light onto it, more from a Jewish perspective, would be the Jewish Encyclopedia. I'm almost positive that I've gone through and looked at Pontius Pilate in that reference, and they do not like him. I'll put it that way. Again, I mean, pushing this to the point where Pilate would be trying to make a concession to a Jew is just non-indicative of what everything I've read. Yeah, I would invite you guys to at least look up those three. I can give you the links to them, or well, not the links, but because they're books. But I can definitely provide those in the underbar afterwards, so you guys can go, if you're interested.
Yeah.
Again, I don't want to get hung up on this one.
Just a brief.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Right, but just a brief point of. I want to make a point of clarification here that it sounds like Ned is saying we have reason to be skeptical that Pilate would do this, and it sounds like Landon is saying that you need to show that it's impossible that he would do this. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah, that's what we're saying.
And I'm just wondering, how do we reconcile it?
Well, I think it's twofold. Number one, I don't think it's indicative of Pontius Pilate specifically, but more encompassing, the more, I guess, grandiose picture is that the Romans never had this tradition. And for them to adopt a Jewish tradition really wasn't reflective of how they were accommodated, for lack of a better term, at the time. Now, would it be impossible? No. And that's why I don't want to get hung up on this one point. I'm just saying, like you did, Matthew, that there's a lot of skepticism when it comes to these these claims that don't seem to reflect what we quote-unquote know about the environment that the narrative is set in. So that's all I wanted to go there. But again, I think we're getting sidetracked and trying to get way too specific. I think it's better, and again, guys, I don't want to railroad this into any way, shape, or form. So if y'all want to stay with this, great. But I feel like I've kind of sidetracked us onto a very specific topic, and I didn't want to do that unless you guys want to go there.
No, I didn't have anything else to say on that, Ned. I do, in fact, you bring up a good point. I did want to give kind of a bibliography just real quick, and this is for the benefit of the listeners. If they enjoy this type of exchange on a more scholarly level, I know there's some particular debates that are very beneficial that they can look up. For example, obviously the ones that involve Bart Ehrman, where he debated Mike Licona, where he debated William Lane Craig. Obviously he had debated James White. Robert Price debated William Lane Craig. Robert Price debated James White. Mike Licona debated Dan Barker. These are just a couple of public debates. I'm sure you can find online if you want to see some more scholarly exchange at a high level regarding this. Some books that are very helpful. My personal mentor, John Warwick Montgomery, edited a book called God's Inerrant Word. This was a symposium that took place that involved R.C. Sproul, J.I. Packer, and a few other guys, which eventually led to the 1978 Chicago Statement of Inerrancy. And your listeners can look up that statement, which is the general conservative Christian approach to the text of Scripture. Norman Geisler's book, Defending Inerrancy. Jeff Brashears has just released a book called Introduction to Bibliology. Daniel Wallace, who is probably, his debate with Bart Ehrman is actually the most poignant, because Daniel Wallace today is working on a project where he's taking digital copies of every single Greek manuscript known to man, and he's actually found over 100 that were not chronicled. So we're actually upwards of almost 5,900 Greek manuscripts because he found some that were not in the chronicle list. He's in a project of doing that right now. He wrote a book called Revisiting the Corruption of the New Testament. Kurt Allen's book, The Text of the New Testament, and of course Michael Kruger has two works, Canon Revisited, and he's a co-author of Heresy of Orthodoxy. So I just wanted to give that contribution to the conversation for your listeners who desire to go a little deeper in this.
Thanks, man. That's definitely.
Well, thank you for that. I did want to just to sort of ground where we are at this point in the discussion. The overall state of the transmission of the accurate, we're setting aside, I assume, for the moment, claims of the accuracy of the events and solely focusing on the transmission of the accountings of the originals, which we don't have. But given any and all sources, any and all of the copies, in other words, dating as far back as we can, all of the documents that we have, are both of you still allowing that there is this percentage of errancy? No, I don't want to say errancy. This percentage of 97 to 99% that we can rely on as far as accuracy of what was originally written. Are both of you still acknowledging that that percentage is accurate as far as the scholarly world is concerned?
I'll mention a couple different aspects of that, Matthew. If people are interested in the more fuller defense of the Byzantine line of text, look up Dr. Maurice Robinson. He's a New Testament scholar from Southeastern Seminary. I tried to look up his book on Amazon. It's currently out of print. They sold out already. For people that are looking for a scholarly defense of the Byzantine line of text, which is the fuller text, which would include the longer ending of Mark, the Pericope Adulterae, the Comma Johannian that we spoke of earlier. Now, what you're speaking to, Matthew, is the specific early Greek manuscripts. Personally, I favor Dr. Robinson's approach for the simple fact I don't think they have to be Greek to be validated and authentic. I can use the Coptic, Syriac, and Latin text. This gives us over 20,000 manuscripts to deal with within the first 400 years of the Christian faith, because you can compare them. You can take the Coptic translation of the Greek and with the early Greek manuscripts, and you can even get a more fuller understanding of what was said. So I think when we're allowed to utilize the other languages and make comparisons, that number shrinks greatly. But even if we were just to utilize the Greek, and I understand those that do, I know Dr. James White is one and several others. He wrote a book called The King James Only Controversy, which addresses that the reason that a lot of scholars that would utilize the Greek manuscript as such would agree with you, that yes, we do have this 1% that is questionable, whether it be the Galatians 1:8, we have some kind of funny transmissions of that. I believe there's a passage in Hebrews chapter 2. We have a couple of these that need a little bit more work to validate or to authenticate, or basically if we find that they're overly corrupted and we don't need them, we have no problem removing them from the Scripture, because the overall theme of Christ, born of a virgin, living a sinless life, dying on a cross, bodily resurrecting from the dead for the propitiation of sins, that sinners can be justified before a holy God, and based on that we can be forgiven of our sin, is universally held. And if any of these verses that are up for debate are not going to tamper with that central doctrine.
Okay, I mean, I guess if I'm hearing you right, I mean the reasons that you've got that you feel that are making the Scripture authentic and you can trust it, as Trey was alluding to, the authors and the original texts, the number of publications. I mean, we haven't got into like known historical figures. I don't know if you guys. I mean, we know Pilate exists. At least we know to at least the same degree as we know anything else. Could y'all kind of give us, I guess, a bullet point rundown of anything outside that leads you to believe? Because it kind of just seems like that we're just going back into the same deal. Well, this book says this book says this book says this, but at the end of the day, we don't know that for sure because we don't have the original texts. And I guess my biggest problem is that even if we find, let's say that we do find the original text, that still doesn't speak to the authenticity or the correctness of that text. The message being actual and real, that God does exist. In the same way that if I had my son, well, I'll just put it out there, my wife has multiple degrees, including PhDs in mathematics. So the source material that he would get this from is as high as you can go. And she tells him 2 plus 2 is 5, and has him copy it down 50,000 times. Now, the transmission is exact. The original text from the author, my wife, let's say in this case, we have that. We have a recorded conversation where she did tell him that. Now, just because the transmission is correct, just because the person that said it was an authority, doesn't mean that 2 plus 2 is 5. And it seems to me kind of that we're almost putting the cart before the horse, in that we're begging the question that God is real. The Bible is correct in what it says, and now all we're doing is trying to see how accurate that transmission of information was. I think we need to start with, was the original information correct? And I know I went on a tangent there. What I'm really asking, guys, is can you give us kind of a bullet point breakout of, what reasons you hold dear and really compel you to believe that, this is something to have faith in?
That's a fantastic question, actually, Ned. Especially, like I said, the contextualization. The biggest thing is, typically we think that people have a hard time of understanding the authenticity of the Bible. Like I said, you have a very good grasp on that. The Bible has been transmitted incredibly well. But your question is more to, were the authors reliable? Were the original texts really reliable to what they said? And the question, and so, I'll be happy to answer that and why I personally believe that they were. We're talking about people who were present to the situation. So, if you're talking about people who you wanted to know about Jesus, if God came down to this earth and he died on a cross, you want people who were there. You want people who knew him, who saw him after he rose. This isn't a question of I don't care about Pontius Pilate's opinion on Jesus. I know that he didn't become a believer after Jesus was resurrected, and I know that this probably caused him daily pain and suffering, having all these Christians pop up in his jurisdiction, especially after the brutal, cruel way that he massacred their God. So, make no mistake, I think that the reason that we're so comfortable with the authenticity of the New Testament is because we have the stories from the people who walked with Jesus and their peers, people who, as part of demonstrations of their divine mandate, were able to perform miraculous signs just as Jesus did. People who were commanded by Jesus, people who saw him after he resurrected. I want a first eyewitness testimony. I wasn't there. Just like anything in this world, I want a testimony. Just like you're interested in my testimony, I want a person who saw it. So the reason that we can be so convinced is because these people were eyewitness testimonies. They put their entire lives, their destinies into this, and they were massacred and slaughtered and brutally killed for what they said, for the beliefs that they advocated. Not just the apostles, but also their followers were tortured. Some were crucified upside down. Some were thrown off of the temple and then stoned to death at the base of the temple. Make no mistake, these people died in an excruciating way, with only one exception. And make no mistake, their testimony, that's pretty valid in my book. That's one of those things where, I ask a guy, let's say I had the privilege of not just reading their books, I ask a guy myself, hey, did Jesus really come back from the dead? And he's at the point of death. He is going to be tortured, and all he has to do to save himself is say, no, man, that didn't happen. And instead, he chooses to suffer and die. That's pretty compelling. It's pretty convincing. That's just me.
Okay.
To be honest, I'd
Trey,
like to
let
toss
me.
that over to Landon too.
I would like to ask just quickly, based on what you just said, the source of, and don't take this the wrong way, but the source of confidence for you in the veracity of the copies of the eyewitness accounts is how sincerely they held to their truth, how sincerely the original apostles, the followers of Jesus, held to their beliefs even at point of death. How sincere they were about it, that it was accurate. That is what provides you with the confidence that you have that it was true. Is that what I'm understanding?
I'd say two parts. That's very accurate, but the second part of that is the fact that they were present. They saw the risen Jesus. And I'll be honest, if you can be as sincere as you want, but if you didn't see the risen Jesus, it doesn't matter how sincere you were.
Okay. I mean, and
okay. So to follow up on that, just one other thing. Just to follow up on that, you are talking about the copies of the original accounts. Everything that they say is still based off of the copies, which we don't have. So that's just, I know I keep bringing that back up, but that's just a point of my skepticism at it. It doesn't mean that they didn't believe these things. It just means that since we don't have the originals, we only have the copies, we are still relying on what the copies say they said, not what they said. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, I was going to let Landon jump in if he wanted to add something.
Yeah, thank you, Ned. Just real quick, I think one of the ways to falsify this claim, there's actually several approaches. I wanted to mention Ignatius of Antioch, which a lot of church legend has it. We can't find conclusive evidence, but in the example given in Mark chapter 9, where Jesus sets a little lad on his lap and says, "The kingdom of heaven is like this one," it's believed that that was Ignatius of Antioch, and we have his writings, and he's writing, "This stuff truly happened. It really happened," as an eyewitness testimony. So it's not just we have early attestation, for example, of Paul, 1 Corinthians 15. It's one of the earliest documented manuscripts we have, but we have their successors. We have John the Apostle, exiled to the Isle of Patmos. He had two students, Papias and Polycarp. Polycarp had a student, Irenaeus. Papias has a lineage that goes all the way to Eusebius. It isn't just the single eyewitness testimony of these gentlemen, the original apostles and their immediate successors, and the fact that they were martyred for their faith, but it's the fact that that succession continued on. Their students continued the story, and it's the broad-basedness of the story itself. And the second line of evidence is, this is a very easy thing to falsify, fellas, is all you have to do is produce a body. That's all you have to do. The only account that we have is an early Jewish book called the Toledoth, which started to present the idea that they had that the body had been stolen out of the tomb. But we don't have a single line of evidence in any way, shape, or form that shows that the body was actually produced. The apostles saw it and denied it anyway. We have no evidence of a body. We have no line of transmission that proves that a body was provided in any way, shape, or form. This thing could have been squashed early, and it wasn't. And even in Josephus' writing, he doesn't confirm the miracle, but he writes, and this is first century. I mean, this is the 90s after the destruction of the temple. He writes that those that follow Christ believed he performed these things. And so now, granted, the idea of, quote, believing yeah, go ahead.
Just one quick point on that. When someone believes something very sincerely to the point that they're willing to die, I understand that that is very persuasive. However, it doesn't mean that they were right. And it doesn't mean that they were lying. It doesn't mean that they are intending to deceive. It just means that they believe it is true. Someone can believe something is true, but that doesn't make it true just in and of itself. So,
well, let me address that. Let me address that real quick.
That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, no, we can talk about the medical.
Landon, let me just add one little thing to that, and then I definitely want you to come back. Go ahead, go where you're going to go, but at the end or at the beginning, however you want to do it, could you address how you feel about, let's say, the Islamic suicide bombers? These people die in pretty horrific ways from time to time, self-inflicted, in fact. Not to mention what has happened to Buddhists in China, what's happened to the Hindus. I mean, all religious people from time to time have been persecuted, and people have died for their faiths. So when you say that these people believed so fervently that they would die, okay, that's compelling, but it's only compelling if it's a one-off event. And what I mean is it one religion restricted to? So if you could kind of square that circle for us at the end, go ahead.
Yeah, certainly. Let me go ahead and answer that first. I do have a list of medical reports that talk about grief hallucination, Messiah complex, and some of the other mental disorders, because Jack Kent was one of the earlier proponents of this that Anthony Flew tried to write on, and Gary Habermas has done incredible, extensive work refuting this. And I don't think the DSM-5, which came out in 2013, has added anything from what the DSM-4 had said about hallucination. Hallucinations are never long-lasting. They never happen to groups of people, and we've never seen anything like that. It's the broad-basedness of this event itself. There is no one single psychological thing that would account for this event happening. The second point is, if it actually did happen, what would we expect to see? See, this is what has to be considered is, as C.S. Lewis, part of his conversion, somebody who studied mythology, he saw how these things were written. And he said, guys, I know mythology. I study it. I got my PhD on it. This isn't mythology. You can tell by how it's written. Now, on the second part, the idea of sincerity doesn't make something true. Usually when people are going to start a story, or if they're going to try to make something up, they typically have one of three things to gain: money, sex, or power. The apostles and their immediate predecessors acquired none of this based on what they were saying. In fact, it was the exact opposite. So to compare that to the Muslim, yes, they sincerely believe it, but what is the claim that's being made? What is it that they say that they believe? The Muslim just believes what the Quran already says as a promise, and they're dying according to that promise they think is going to be fulfilled. These early apostles died based on their testimony that Christ had in fact bodily resurrected. So the difference is the nature of the claim and the fact that they didn't kill themselves and kill other people. They simply were killed and persecuted based on that testimony, and there is no single psychological abnormality that could explain the variety. We're talking over 500 people at different places, different walks of life, men, women, some rich, some poor. There's nothing that explains that unless the event actually happened.
Okay, and I mean, that, again, that would be compelling, but we have the exact same...
I'd like to speak on that.
Okay, I'll let you go after. Let me follow up real quick. We have the exact same type of martyrism reflected in other religions, including, like I said, the Buddhists, the Sikhs, the Hindus, all of that we see throughout history. People will, when they fervently believe, they will go to the grave literally, either at their own hand, as we see with the Islamic belief, and on the other hand, under their own. Now, that you want to speak to why they would do that. Well, if they were to denounce their God, regardless what God that is, if it's the Hindu, if it's the, let's go back to the people you're talking about. If they denounce Jesus as God, the problem is now their punishment is eternal. Their punishment is horrific, not to mention the payoff if they are Job-like and stay the course all the way through their death. If they believe they're going to get that eternal reward or have the eternal punishment hanging over them, it's conceivable, if not probable, in my opinion, that they would do just that. They would say, I don't have a choice. I believe this, and I'm going to, just as we see in other religions. Sorry, Matthew, go ahead.
That sort of is very similar to what the objection that I was going to raise, that you mentioned money, sex, or power, Landon, as the most common or most prevalent, most persuasive motivations for someone to have that sort of conviction. But when we're talking about the context at the time in a Jewish culture, was that God was very much distant. I guess the closest that I can think of, just to bring it to modern times, would be rather than a personal relationship with God that a Christian has, the deist sort of concept of this great and inaccessible being, to have suddenly to believe that you do have this entity, this powerful, loving entity that cares about you and is going to take care of you and fix everything wrong with the world, and sacrificed himself for you. When you have that level of love, of impact on your life, the loyalty alone would be very persuasive. And so the gratitude is one thing. When someone has done something for you, you feel grateful, and I think that sincerity plus the potential ramifications of renouncing and going to hell, and however you define hell, those alone would be powerful enough deterrents to not renounce. So you could believe I think is very important. The point is very important to make here is that I am not claiming that they were under delusions. I am not claiming that they were crazy. I am not claiming that they had hallucinations, anything like that.
And neither am I, just to be clear.
The reasons that they believed.
I can actually answer that one pretty
I
easily.
do not think that's the case.
Yeah.
What I am saying, rather than is that just that they were wrong.
Yeah, I understand.
That they were deluded, just that they were wrong.
I get what you mean by that. I have just as a point of what Landon was saying when it's about the claim that's relevant. It's about how were they wrong, because don't get me wrong, you're talking about a faith system where you're right. Jesus said something truly unique in his time period when he claimed to be God, because the perception of God in the Jewish culture was he was outside of time itself. He is the creator of all. He isn't this person or personal being. So when Jesus made the claim he was God, that was probably C.S. Lewis said it was the most revolutionary thing that any individual has ever stated. In that culture, that's entirely shocking. So to give you an idea, when Jesus claimed to be God, you see, the whole thing is like, just like Landon is my friend and Ned is your friend, like we know our friends to a certain degree. I'll be honest with you, if I watched Landon get beaten, crucified, murdered, buried, and then he came and visited me the next couple of, or like over the weekend, I would be kind of shocked. That would transform my life. The problem is I'm not these guys didn't die because of a faith. These guys didn't die because they were Jews. They didn't die because of a pro-con list on how they viewed eternity. They died because they witnessed something revolutionary. They died because they saw Jesus die after being tortured and killed at the Romans. Like you said, as Ned posited, Pontius Pilate is famous for this. He doesn't just torture and kill, he does it with flair. They saw the risen God. They saw somebody come back from the dead. And then after witnessing this, and thousands of other people witnessing this, they created a movement. So the biggest thing is, just like Landon said, it only takes one person to come up and go against their testimony, and the contestation would end. All they have to do is bring the body out, and the contest ends. And these people, obviously, They didn't believe in 72 virgins or an ethereal afterlife. They believed in the risen Christ because they physically saw it, touched it, and ate with it.
Trey, that
Yeah.
I'm sorry, man, but that's not fair, because they did believe the ethereal afterlife. That's all that Jesus preached the entire time, is how to get into heaven is through me. I mean, if they believed what you're saying, and
Well,
you can't just hand wave that away and say that the only reason that they're standing by their testimony was because they saw this guy. Well, I've seen magicians, but I'm not going to, and magicians have done some incredible things less than a foot away from me that I can't explain. Now, I'm not going to die because I think that that person is a, really possesses magical powers or whatever. It's a trick, and I don't know the method of the trick. But the point that I'm making is that the reason, and I think Mathew did it too, the only reason that people are that willing to sacrifice themselves is because there is a payoff. The payoff is what Jesus preached, at least in their mind. And I fully understand. They believe, if this stuff actually happened, they believed at the time that Jesus did it. In the same way that the Buddhists believed when 500,000 of them were killed. When there was a time, I can't remember exactly when it was, but I know it was before Jesus. In fact, I think it was, I can't remember exactly, but I mean, there was one of the emperors said, "Give me 100 heads of the Buddhist people preaching," and they did. They didn't announce it. They went out. The warriors went and cut the heads off and brought them back. Now, why didn't those people denounce Buddhism? Why didn't they say Buddha is a fake? Buddha was not really God. They believed just as fervently that Buddha was God, or at least had attained enlightenment, as much as, if we take all this as true, which I'm willing to grant, that all of these people have died for that, they believed. And so to say that that is, I guess, bulletproof, that is incredibly compelling, I'm sorry, but to me it doesn't get there just because we have so many examples. I mean, think of it this way. You want to go to the Aztecs and the Incas. These people willingly walked to the top of the these pyramids and had their heart cut out of their chest, laid down willingly, didn't fight, didn't, just completely said, "Do it to me." That's pretty horrific, and that, in my opinion, takes quite a bit of belief. If we have examples of that, it's not surprising that we have examples of people dying for this religion also. That's all I'm trying to posit here.
I understand what you mean. Yeah, I get that. The one thing I would point out is the largest difference is, once again, what they witnessed. The biggest difference is, let's say I tell you I'm God, I die, and I stay in my grave. The problem is the most relevant aspect of what they witnessed. I understand what you mean about dying for the faith or dying for what you believe in. I get what conviction can make you do. But the problem is, these guys couldn't be tricked into this. They lived with Jesus for multiple years, and they witnessed him.
But Trey, that's begging the question. In other words, you are assuming before that statement that actually happened. And as we've gone over a couple of times, we don't even have the original documentation of that happening, let alone any way to know definitively 100% outside of faith, outside of trusting what the Bible says, that those stories actually took place.
Well, let me ask, Ned, if it actually did take place, what would you expect the writings to look like?
If it did take place or didn't take place?
If it did take place. See, that this is the problem. This came up in the Robert Price-James White debate, because Robert Price flat out said it is impossible for these documents to be correct because of what they're saying. And if that's the posture you're going to take, then there is no evidence. There's nothing we can possibly say to you to confirm this within the historical framework and understanding any aspect of history. We would simply ask the question, if the events actually did happen, the way that they're written seems pretty consistent with how that took place. Again, all they have to do is produce the body.
Well, again, I mean, you keep coming back to the body, and I want to address that real quick, and I definitely want to get back to what your original, your point was. But producing the body sounds simple.
Ned,
okay.
I want to follow up on.
Okay.
I want to follow up on the point about the body when you're done.
Okay, and then I'll go back into the beginning of Landon's. As much as it sounds easy to quote unquote just produce a body, I mean, we today, with the technology, the forensics, the ability to track people, the surveillance in damn near every city on the planet, people go missing every day, and we never find their bodies. So to me, and again, this is my conjecture, and I'm not saying that this happened, I'm just saying that to me this is just as possible, is that they took the body and disposed of it. Now, if they would have done that and then made the claim after that fact, it's how are you going to produce a body that's been disposed of, to keep it kind of non-graphic? You can't.
Hang on 1 second now, buddy. I mean, You realize the monumental claim you just made that the disciples actually did take the body out, disposed of it, and then went out and got martyred for that lie? We don't know of anybody ever being martyred for a known lie. That is a very radical claim, buddy.
I would be careful there, Landon, because I can produce quite a few people that's been martyred for lies, for all kinds of lies. But again, I don't want to get sidetracked there. In fact, if you want to do another hangout, we can definitely do that. But what I'm saying is that for whatever...
I wanted to...
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Matthew. I'm sorry, I did cut you off.
I think that we should just completely, at the moment, avoid the lie aspect of this. There's no need to invoke a lie. There's no need to invoke any sort of active, intentional deception. It's just not necessary, and it's not something that I'm claiming. It's not something that is any way supportable. What I think it comes down to is, as you say, produce a body. Well, I don't understand that, because just by having the body not be there doesn't prove that it was resurrected. It just means that we don't have it. Since we don't have it, there's no way to say one way or another, and it's a big leap to go. The default is that it was resurrected just because we don't have it. Well, there are a lot of natural explanations, possible explanations, for what could have happened to it, and even if we can't think of one, that doesn't mean there isn't a natural explanation that we will never know. So that is an unknown that we have to take into account. Just as a possibility, there are a lot of things that could have happened that we may never know. So just saying produce the body as a way to negate the claims, the beliefs of the disciples, of the witnesses, just not having a body isn't enough to establish that it was resurrected. It's enough to establish that we don't have the body. Therefore, there are a lot of possibilities. That's as far as it goes, as far as I'm concerned.
If you was to presuppose the non-existence of God on the front end and then try to approach the data because you're appealing to an explanation that has no evidence, and if that's what you're leaning toward, that's fine. You're being consistent that way. If you're taking a purely methodological, naturalistic perspective and approaching the evidence as such, you're saying, well, we don't know what could have happened to the body. I mean, there could have been a line of evidence to show it, and that's what I'm saying is there is no evidence that they were shown the body, and that's pivotal. That's pivotal to what we're saying is that this thing could have been squashed immediately, and there was a lot of groups that wanted this thing killed. The Jewish Sanhedrin locally in the place that happened. I mean, you have enemy attestation at the place that it happened. If you're going to start a lie and a rumor, you don't do it where it could be falsified. That's the worst thing you can do, where the crucifixion took place in Jerusalem, and run around and tell a lie about it. I mean, you're going to have everybody writing and saying these wackadoos that call themselves Christians are saying that this famous guy who got buried in this rich guy's tomb We can go over the tomb and look at it, fellas. We know this is wrong. We don't have that.
Okay, and again, Landon, I'm sorry to take us down that rabbit hole. So
I grant all of that.
And again, like I said,
just one second, Ned. I want to address it.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's Landon. I do not presuppose that it's wrong. I do not presuppose that there is no God. I presuppose that the natural world exists and we can understand it to some degree. That's it. And that leads me to be skeptical of people who make claims about the natural world that don't seem to follow anything else in the natural world. So I am not presupposing that the Bible is wrong, that God doesn't exist, anything like that.
Right.
I don't need to. So the other point, just quickly, the other point is that someone can believe something that is wrong. I'm sure you will agree that Muslims who blow themselves up for 72 virgins are wrong to do so. They're just wrong.
We're just
now
not being clear.
They may have been misled. They may.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Matthew. I'm just not being clear in distinguishing the difference between what's being stated by the apostles and the Muslim that kills himself. I'm going to try it a different way. Again, the Quran is already written, and we're over 1,600 years past the point that it's written. When a contemporary Muslim flies himself into a building, he's banking on what the Quran says will happen to him should he do what he does. That's what he's putting his trust in. And so, yes, he's actively passionate about what the promises are there. Now, this person today has never seen Muhammad. He was never, there in Mecca, Medina when the Quran was being written. None of that. It's not the same category. This is what I really want to separate. Is you're talking about somebody who actually saw something that was there, and it's the succession of writing from the patristic sources that corroborate it, plus the enemy attestation, Marabar Serapion, Flavian, Pliny the Younger, Suetonius. We have several other hostile witnesses that say that the Christian writers and the original apostles believed that what Christ did. Now, again, a belief doesn't make it so, but if God exists, I guess if you guys would grant, if God exists, then miracles are possible. And if miracles did happen, how else would you expect them to be documented if it actually took place?
Well, I think that, and that goes back to what you were asking before. And I mean, I guess that.
How would we ever?
Matt, okay, so how would we, if we start from that premise, we grant that everything you've said about the Bible so far is true. Okay, for whatever reason, we're going to grant that. So the authors and the original text, all of that you said about that, the number of publications is compelling. The main characters, appearance in the real world, so to speak, and the people were there to record it and die for those events because they believed it. Historical figures, appearing in the narrative, like Pontius Pilate, and you go on and on and on. There were, I guess, known historical events referenced, and I guess the consistency is the other thing that you guys, have really hit on as far as it being whatever. And when I get, I guess, to this point with some people, that the correlation, or not the correlation, the analogy that I use here to demonstrate why trying to use that can be problematic really makes some people uncomfortable and even mad. And I hope that when I get to the end of this, you understand I'm not doing this to belittle you or make you guys look bad. The only reason that I'm doing it is to show that if we rely on those with 100% certainty, we can be misled. So what I'm going to say is I've got a publication that has hundreds of millions of copies, and these copies are absolutely perfect because they were photocopied. It's one of the highest selling books in the history, or at least series of books in the history of mankind. In fact, pre-orders on one publication alone, it's an ongoing series, reached over 500,000 pre-orders at one point. The person in this is one of the most recognizable figures in the world. You can go anywhere on the planet and show a picture, and people will know exactly who you're talking about. If this person actually exists in the city that this person resides. As of April 27th this year, 2015, I found at least 22 matches for that name, and at least one that was an exact match down to the letter and middle name. So from a historical perspective, it seems that person exists. When we look at publications, this person has been in the Wall Street Journal. They've been in what else? I just lost my Business Week did an entire article on them. The New York Post did an entire layout. There is recorded documentation, both eyewitness account and video evidence of this person doing what would be considered superhuman tasks from the late 80s on. I mean, and it's not just in that one city. I mean, it's happened here in Chicago. It's happened in Dallas. It's happened in New York. I mean, these are very, very well documented occurrences. Now, if we take all of that into account, and then we say, okay, well, what else can we pile on top of it? Well, there's 5 presidents that appear in this publication. One of them was completely about the inauguration of Barack Obama. Very historically accurate to the letter. 9/11 appeared in it. There were events in ~68. I mean, it goes back where there was a demonstration at Columbia University that was documented in this. At least it was referenced in that. The message never changes. The same message from the day that it was published, the number 1 all the way through, has been exactly the same. And the biggest thing is we have the original texts and the original authors still with us. And who I'm talking about, that message is, with great power must also come great responsibility. And yeah, I'm talking about Spider-Man. Now, I hope that you're understanding why I'm using that. I'm not using that to belittle or say that the Bible's fiction or even a fairy tale. That's not where I'm going. What I'm saying is I think I've established have at least as much quote unquote evidence, if we use it the way you guys were using it, for Spider-Man's existence, especially if we separate 2,000 years. We put 2 millennia between now and today. You could forgive some people for thinking that Spider-Man actually did exist based on everything that we have. So what I'm saying is that if you constrain yourself to using that type of methodology, and you don't allow for the possibility of it not existing and exploring the controversies, it's easy to get trapped into that one thing. And just as Landon, you said about me, which I'll absolutely admit, that I start from a naturalistic perspective. Now, one thing you did say, and I want to make sure I'm clear on this, I'm not saying that the Bible is false. I don't know. All I'm saying is I think there's a lot of reason to be skeptical of it. So you guys start from the other end, that God is real, and then use all of these tick marks, if you will, to substantiate that claim, which is fine. The problem that I think me and Mathew both have, which I think a lot of skeptics do, is that it seems, whereas we will fully admit that, look, we could be completely wrong on this, you guys have absolute knowledge, or at least claim to have. There's no possibility that you're incorrect. And maybe I've misheard you, or maybe I'm miscategorizing you, but that was my diatribe. So, guys, please come back on that, and I hope I didn't offend you, because I really didn't mean to.
I love Spider-Man.
Good. So I don't know if you're bad.
I don't know if you can tell from my shrine. I'm a bit of a comics buff.
Oh, nice. So you probably knew from square one who I was talking about.
You know what? I caught it on. I caught on eventually. I'm just like, yeah. No, I know exactly. I know exactly what you mean too. What we're talking about is about a comprehensive historical understanding. Just like I will say, one of the hardest parts about about comparing canonization to like Marvel Comics canonization. It kills me. Comics change their canon all the time. Like even Peter Parker, his history has changed. It kills me deep down inside. But I will say this: when you look at it, we have to. You probably. I don't know if we come off this way, but we're very skeptical in and of ourselves. I hate to say it, when you're a Christian, we have a lot of denominationalism and sects inside of our faith. So when I say we're skeptical, we have to be incredulously detailed on a lot of things about our faith, even inside of our faith. Not even when we're talking about talking to other people about our faith, but just people inside of our own churches and communities. So the biggest thing is when you're looking at the basic criteria we'll have is, manuscripts and historical context, and you start looking at what we have, because you can't look at what you don't have, right? I can't tell what wasn't written. I can only tell what was written. And then I have to take it as either valid or not valid. And then I have to presuppose reasons for either. Nothing wrong with it either way, I might add. But the biggest thing is when I look at the scriptures and I look at the accounts that these people made, I hold them to be valid because it is the most logical course when you're looking at it if you assume that they're books. Now, if you assume that they were, like I said, an intentional, purposeful, idealistic, propaganda or the perpetuation of a new religion, that isn't as uniform or consistent with what I see in the natural world around me. I see people die for a lie all the time, but I don't see people die for lies that they know when they're giving witness. Like, I don't see a person go and give perjured testimony on the witness stand on a torture rack. That's something that's very, very uncommon. I've never seen that before. So by comparison, it's a little bit of a contextualization. These guys come from a very legalized culture. The law is very important to them. And, the way we look at it is coming from that understanding that each one of these people gave an account. There is going to be truth to it, or there's going to be falsehood. Now, the irony is, I understand not believing any historical accounts. Don't get me wrong, we could discount the Annals of History, Pliny the Younger, all these other ones. It's actually very simple to dismiss a lot of them, but the problem is, just from what I see in the world around me, historical context, books that are produced for a purpose, just like comic books, they provide me entertainment. Well, historical records, they're not always accurate, but when I look at it with textual criticism, the things that are inconsistent in most books aren't present in the Bible. For instance, you don't see claims of two different cultures winning a battle at the exact same time, both sides saying they won. That happens throughout history and every other historical documentation, and yet it's not prevalent in the Bible. So there are certain things that are very unique about the Bible as a historical document that makes me lean this way because of just the basic account that it makes. Now, I understand, some people could believe that they were just wrong, but the problem is the account that they give me isn't one where it's like, oh, well, I got tricked by a magic trick. They didn't give me one where, maybe they got confused. They go through a very detailed account of what they witnessed in the Gospels and what it meant to them. And so, unfortunately, like I said, it's very compelling, not because they died for it or anything like that. It's because of the level of the eyewitness. It's the same as if a person was to give testimony in a court in modern day and age. The reason that I consider one person more credible than another This is, like I said, I don't want you guys to have anything take this personally either. It amuses me because I know that Landon has stood in the empty tomb before. He's been to Jerusalem. He's had that privilege. But make no mistake, when we look at giving an account historically and under the gun, as it were, the problem is these guys stood up for a very specific testimony. Now, I understand.
Trey,
yeah, go ahead.
But I mean, I would equate that to what we see in modern day with people coming back from psychics and giving their testimony that, look, he or she knew things that only my dead parent knew, only my dead child. I mean, they believe that these things happened. They believe to the point of, giving up all of their wealth. Some people believe in some of the spiritual healers, Christian and others, to the point of literally dying because they quit taking chemo and they quit taking, Western medicine. So, again, those incorrect beliefs are not, I guess, out of the ordinary. The claims in the Bible that you're saying that these people witnessed and the things that they're attesting to, I fully believe if they happened and those people were real, they believed it. But we have the exact same thing going on today with things that we definitively know are wrong. And people literally sacrificing their lives because of that incorrect information.
Well, here's the one major difference I would point out. Obviously.
Let me just jump in here.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Matt.
Hey, Trey, let me just jump in with one small. I don't want there to be any misunderstanding about where we're coming from. The way that I'm approaching this as a general methodology is not to start out, it is wrong, they were wrong, they cannot possibly have been right. I'm starting out with, should I believe, and saying, what are the reasons why I should believe? Now, what you're saying about why you believe the accountings, why you believe the witness accountings, the all of it, and the reason that they would have said what they did, doesn't, to me, overcome the possibility, even probability, even though the probability is unknown, that there is some unknown involved, that they could have been wrong. I see people as fallible beings. People can make mistakes. And unless we can overcome that capacity for error of making mistakes, it doesn't matter who we're talking about, whether it is an eyewitness to the crucifixion of Jesus, or you or me. People are prone to error, especially when they want something. We want there to be meaning to life. We want there to be something to live for. We want to find happiness. We want to find love. All of these things direct how we live our lives. And that doesn't mean that we are untrustworthy. It only means that we have to accept our limitations, our capacity for error. And that is the same standard that I hold myself to everyone that I know to, as far as accepting the claims that they make. And that goes all the way back to the people who say they saw Jesus. Now, the problem, as always, that we come back to is that we are still talking about copies of the original accountings. And the original accountings we don't have. So, we are still going by not what the disciples said, but what was written about what they said. So you're adding extra layers of possibility of error to the original witness accountings. So do you understand why?
Yeah, I
I'm
see what you're saying.
So
hey, Trey, I'm sorry, Matthew, just real quick, buddy. I felt like we've kind of talked about the the manuscript number and the transmission to try to get back to the original enough, Matthew? I think the listeners could just spin back and listen to it on the front end. I think to address kind of the hinge point where we are, there's always going to be a point in every dialogue, man, where there's going to be this point of data where we agree to disagree. And let's just say I took the approach that I'm, and I don't want to be offensive here. I really, really don't. What if I felt like I was unconvinced by the atheistic worldview, that it was actually atheism and atheist literature in my younger years that drove me to consider religious options? And in the arena of ideas, of religious options, I found that the Judeo-Christian Bible stood alone in the sense of its historicity, its prophetic proclamation, and in that context, in the context of coming out of the Old Testament, Judaism, in that culture, we have all this stuff we've talked about in the New Testament. So I'm granting, because I'm convinced by several other reasons that it would take us hours to discuss, but let's say I'm convinced at the existence of the triune God of Scripture, or let's just say an omniscient, omnipotent, immaterial deity that's eternal. Let's say I'm convinced by that, and then I take that onto all the evidence that we've given today. That's how we're warranted. What we're presenting is not in and of itself a compulsive argument that ought to persuade anybody by itself. We don't attempt to try to persuade it that way. You're asking us as Christians, why would we believe these manuscripts the way that they are? Well, Trey gave 25 minutes of a really good scholarly approach as to why we trust the historicity and the historical transmission. I've footnoted several debates that people can watch. It's not a lack of IQ. It's not that Daniel Wallace isn't smart. It's not that D.A. Carson isn't smart. These guys are incredibly intelligent. So, and I'm not saying that atheists aren't intelligent. Bart Ehrman is incredibly intelligent. Robert Price has got an encyclopedia genius. So it's not a matter of IQ. It's just what persuades us to comply with that is not the same evidence that you guys are going to accept. And you've illustrated the reasons why you would be skeptical. You would, you just gave the example of humans, the preoccupation to error. Well, I would say just because humans can error doesn't mean that they must error. You can actually copy things correctly. You don't have to make mistakes. I agree. Yeah, so we can trust because there's so many manuscripts to pick from. Yeah. But I'm sorry, that's because I know we have to get close to wrapping up within the next 10 minutes. I just wanted to illustrate that one point that we are going to agree to disagree. That's undeniable. But if you're asking us, if you push me against the wall and make me, you're making me tap out and say, all right, now why are you coming in? Let's just say, you know what, I'm not convinced by the atheistic worldview as a whole, so now I'm thrust into these religious claims, and nobody else has the historical backing, especially resurrecting from the dead like Jesus of Nazareth.
You know what? That might be an interesting show for down the line, as far as what you were saying there is you're not convinced by the atheistic worldview. I think that would be an interesting kind of, I guess, discussion to have, because to be honest, I don't know what you mean by that, and I would really like to investigate that, because I think that would be really cool to see where you guys see us falling short in the same way.
I second that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be awesome, because that kind of gives you guys the chance to turn the table, so to speak. But yeah, I mean,
I would be okay doing one on comic books.
Okay, I mean, Landon brought up that since we're atheists and you guys were Christians, since we've been kind of holding your feet to the fire for a couple of weeks, you guys could do the same with us and say, well, why do you believe this? Why do you believe this? And some of the stuff we might believe, some we might not. But yeah, and Landon, just to springboard off of what you said, all the stuff that you were saying, the historicity and all the people, what I invite people to do, and again, the reason that I brought up that Spider-Man analogy was, if you go through Spider-Man and you use the same tests, you say, okay, let's look at it from a historical perspective. Wow, there's a lot of things that line up. Let's look at it and just go down the list. It lines up, in my opinion, as well as the Bible, in some cases even better, because like I said, we have literally videotape of people, quote unquote, playing Spider-Man, climbing buildings in Chicago and Dallas and New York and whatever. But again, I don't want to get back into that. But if you could just, and I think that's kind of where me and Matthew come at it from, is, okay, that's interesting. Let's see if we can break it, because at the very essence of at least my education, that's what I was taught to do. In physics, with the scientific method, your job is when somebody says something, you don't take it, you test it. Let's see if we can break it. If it says F equals MA, maybe. Let's see if we can find something where F doesn't equal MA. That's kind of where we're coming from. So,
okay, let me summarize the reason that the basic disagreement that we're having here, as Landon is saying, we're ultimately going to agree to disagree, but the basics of it to me can be explained like this. If say Ned is sitting next to me and he walks out of the room and he goes to the store and comes back and says that he drove to the corner store. I don't have any reason to disbelieve him. He comes back with a bag full of Powerade and a candy bar. But if he comes back and says 5 minutes later that he went to California and I'm in South Carolina, I'm going to be skeptical of that. There doesn't seem to be any reason for him to be able to do that in 5 minutes. I would say no. Everything that I know about the world says that makes no sense, and I don't believe you. Now, that doesn't mean that he doesn't possess some sort of teleportation device, and, you know, a transporter from Star Trek, whatever. But I am, I think, justified in being skeptical of him saying he could go to California and back in 5 minutes. That, to me, is the difference between accepting the historical supernatural claims in the Bible versus something like Homer's Odyssey. As far as I know, Plato never claimed to be divine or the holder of perfect truth or God or anything like that, and I hear so often criticisms of, well, you'll accept this accounting, but you won't accept that. Well, it's a difference in criteria. It's a difference in the general tone of what's being said. If you're just talking about the event of something that happened on a day on a battlefield, that's one thing. But what if you say a dragon appeared on the battlefield? Well, I would be skeptical of the historian that said a dragon appeared on the battlefield. But the fact that the battle might have taken place, not so much. That doesn't mean that I automatically believe that the battle took place either. It just means I'm more likely to believe one than the other. So when you throw in the capacity for error and bias that every human being has, except the claims about the resurrection, in a nutshell.
Yeah, obviously, you know, the resurrection of Jesus is the principal doctrine of our entire faith. So that is the ultimate question. And you know, skepticism about God coming to earth and rising again from the dead, that makes perfect sense. You know, if I saw that in the newspaper, I'd be just as skeptical. Somebody came back from the grave. But make no mistake, you know, much like yourself, if I get enough evidence out there, you know, all of a sudden I start getting convinced. And like I said, that's the principal difference, and it's the principal encouragement I like to give people is as long as you're using a uniform like form of textual criticism with any type of text. To be honest, that's why the Bible's so compelling, is because I believe lots of things happened historically that have far less evidence than that. You know, and much of it, there's no problem with you know, or many people, because of the consequences of that one particular belief. I entirely understand, you know, giving it the proper and due consideration, because more than anything else, you're right. That is the most relevant thing in the Bible, is did Jesus come back from the grave? And you know, I encourage people to look up resurrection by Hank Hanegraaff. Dr. Habermas does a great book on that too, and it gives kind of an accounting of our perspective on that one particular documentation. But well, just like Landon, I like to give out a couple of books for people who are interested a little bit more in what we believe. Norman Geisler did a book called From God to Us. It's just over 200 pages, and it goes through the interpretation methodology and the rationale behind it. Just because something is logical and rationally uniform does not mean it's true. So we understand why you can be skeptical of it. We don't judge you for that at all. It's just one of those things where we want people to understand that that we have a very specific understanding and that it is rational.
Okay, well, and I think that makes sense, and I think that it's understandable that that's where you come from. And I mean, we've been going almost 2 hours, guys. I really appreciate the time. I think we probably ought to cut it if we want to have any chance of anybody watching this. But again, guys, I'd love to do it again in a couple of weeks. So I'm just going to let everybody have a couple of minutes to wrap up what they want to say, and we'll, I guess, close it down from there. Unless you guys just want to keep going for another hour. Is that okay with everybody? You want to cut it?
Landon. I just wanted to give Landon the opportunity to say something, since he hasn't in a while, and I want to reiterate on top of Ned's point about Spider-Man. We discussed earlier that talking point, that analogy, and I want to make it clear that that is not in any way to diminish Christianity. By comparing Jesus to Spider-Man at all. Well, that's not the point of the analogy, and it is not to be insulting in any way. I just want to make sure you understand that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I hope I didn't come across as trying to compare the Bible or the Jesus to Spider-Man. No, I was just saying, if we use the same criteria, if we look at historical, if we look at all of the things that have been brought up tonight, they seem to run fairly parallel. So anyway, yeah, Landon, definitely please come in. You hadn't spoken in a while.
Well, I mean, just again, thank you, Ned, for hosting this and letting us come on and being a gracious host and allowing these conversations to take place. Mathew, you as well. You guys, I actually, I have to confess a sin here. Mathew, I covet your voice greatly. You sound like you could be a radio host and have your own radio show, man. I would give anything for that kind of deep voice. But yeah, no, thank you guys very much, Ned, and yeah,
thank you.
And no, I wasn't offended by. I understand it was just an illustration to make a point. I wasn't bothered by that at all, and I just encourage our listeners to maybe rewind or slow down where we gave references, so that Trey and I are neither one. We're not PhDs. We've not published anything formally on this particular topic, but we tried to reference some fellows that have, and hopefully that's beneficial to all that are listening. And man, again, just thank you guys so much, and I hope we can have another conversation.
No, thank you guys. This has been great, and I'd love it to keep
Absolutely.
going. Yeah. Trey, I hope we didn't lose him. Trey, did you want to finish with anything, or?
Oh, no, yeah, I'm still here. I just think my camera went out on me. No, yeah, thanks. I really appreciate you guys letting us come on. And you know what, to be honest, the open discourse is a lot of fun. You guys bring up great points, and it's really enjoyable talking with you guys.
Well, great. All right, well, at that, I guess I'm going to end it. Thanks, everybody, for watching, all 10 people. Hopefully we'll get some more. And hopefully we'll get to do it again sometime soon. Good night, everybody.